it was about a year after I'd finished residency. My husband and I had just gotten married, and we'd been long distance. We hadn't lived in the same place. And so, it's like a year in, and he is learning things about me. I'm learning things about him, and he's learning that I like to read a lot. Like, he knew I like to read, but he's like, no, you actually just always want to be reading. And he got to the point where he's like, I feel like you've got a story in you, and why don't you try writing it? And initially, I blew it off because at the time I was working in an emergency room, and I was doing my shifts and then coming back, and it was busy. But it was before we had kids too, so I had a little bit of time. I had some flexibility, and I thought, well, let me try this out. And I took out a laptop and I just started thinking, what would I want to write about if I was going to start writing? And all my life I sort of grown up with this knowledge, this sort of connection to Afghanistan, to the stories, to the political situation, to the plight of women and girls and the injustices, and that was all inherited from my parents. My husband's also an Afghan. He'd immigrated from the country in the 90s, and so this is something that I'd been working on in community organizations and things like that. And I thought, that's the type of story I would want to read. I would want to read a story about these issues. And so that's what I started writing, were these stories. And, lo and behold, I didn't tell anybody what I was doing, because I thought my parents would freak out, which they did a little bit. But I didn't tell them until I actually had a publishing contract, and we had a deal that it was going to become a real book, and I wasn't just, holed up in a room spending time writing a story. This is probably the story that came out most organically. And I don't know what it was about the energy of the story. There's something about the storytelling process that, I think now looking back on it with a little bit more of an analytical eye, at that time I was walking into storytelling without any real preparation or real design, right? It was just like, let me Google how to write a book. And so I started with, who do I envision? I really wanted to tell this story about gender inequalities. And it occurred to me that, the person who could tell us best what that differential was would be a little girl who was living as a little boy in Afghanistan, by way of this custom, the bacha posh custom, in which families who do not have a son sometimes transform one of their young daughters into a boy. And then there's the superstitious belief that the next child born into the family will actually be a boy. And so it's something that's sort of done and undone before the child reaches pubertal age. And it changes the perspective of the child, because all of a sudden they can do some things that they couldn't otherwise do. And everyone kind of goes along with it. It's sort of the family accepts it. People in the neighborhood may or may not know about it. If they do know about it, they just accept it. Everyone kind of goes along with it. And it's not like every family is doing this, but there's enough families doing it that everyone kind of knows of one. And so, and that's how I came to her. It was like, who is this little girl who is going to live life as a little boy? What is she going to experience? And how is she going to tell us how hard it is to live that experience and have it taken away? And so, I wanted her to be the voice for just too many, not all, but too many Afghan girls who go through just true injustices, severely traumatic experiences where, all the economic woes of the country, the addiction problems, the consequences of conflict and war, they feel the brunt of it, and it impacts their life very severely. And that's how this little girl came about. So when I started thinking about, okay, let me explore the implications of gender in Afghanistan. In the research process, I came across this old black and white photograph. There was an anthropologist researcher named Louis and Nancy Dupree, both of them were in Afghanistan, and they had these archives. And so in the archives, there was this photograph that was in one of his books of one of the kings of Afghanistan who had a harem. And he didn't trust men to guard his harem. And so he had recruited women and had them dressed as men and used this group to guard his harem. So that's a pretty ingenious idea. And it occurred to me when I'm looking at this photograph of these women dressed as men guarding a harem that, here's another period of time, 100 years prior to the Rahima character that I was building out, where another woman is disguising herself as the opposite gender through clothing, but for a very different reason, and just wanting to explore what their experiences were like and what life was like and how much progress had been made. Because what's been interesting to me is that Afghanistan has really had these ups and downs of women's rights, and that's been it's been a roller coaster ride. My mom graduated from Kabul University as an engineer, and yet this is the same country where, before her, things were very different. After her, things were incredibly different. I mean, there's a period of time, and right now too, where girls are just not allowed to go to school at all. And so I wanted to explore that sort of wild ride that women have been, that women's rights has undergone.